It's tapereading concepts, and in this video we're discussing island formations. Our working definition: the island is a sizable balanced or horizontal price structure left at an extreme on the field and isolated on both sides by steep or vertical price action. The island shows rejection of price levels above the waterline. This is one example of an island. I'll go over another couple of examples and suggest potential opportunities around this price structure. By the definition, we have a steep or relatively vertical climb into extreme on the field. You can see that relative to the Sunday night open, this is the initial move to the downside after the high is left here at 1783, and then once a low is found, it seems right above 1770, price travels outside of the already defined session range into the mid 80s here, and then notice that once it arrives at high prices, it pulls back and consolidates here. You can see that there's a consensus about price being fair here for a while. This price structure overall is sizable at this point, and we can roughly define the waterline as the bottom of this horizontal balance point. In this particular example, the waterline roughly coincides with the Sunday night high, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. The waterline doesn't have to be a reference point already established to the left. The waterline is in general the bottom or top. If we're dipping to the downside, it's the floor or ceiling that is the part of the coil towards the direction from which you broke out. In this case, the floor of this horizontal is the one that's pointing towards the already established session range, and therefore this is the reference point for where the consensus is building up for prices being fair during this episode in time. The island structure really gets confirmed when you get the same quality of movement on the right side, and the expectation with islands is that since the price is moving steeply and it has already climbed steeply through the same price levels, it is likely that it's going to keep eroding back within whatever range or structure it started from until it reaches some solid, in this case support. And you can see that eventually we do reach support, and it's at levels slightly higher than the ones left here initially in the Sunday session. What is the predictive or what are the suggested opportunities that the predictive value of this structure describes? Well, the first one is that if you notice the steep quality of price as it's failing following an extension outside of the previous range, then there's naturally a momentum opportunity that is created, which means that as you start seeing the quickly eroding price action, you can try to jump on board somewhere on the move and try to participate with the speed that's developing, of course, provided that there is enough reward that you can define until some reasonable structure is reached. In this case, likely somewhere close to this base. Now, very often, because of the steep erosion in price as we're leaving the island, you're not going to get significant pendulum pullbacks or discounts within the movement in order to place favorably. Most of the time what you will see is microstructures or little consolidations, little pullbacks, and very often the best place to take the opportunity will actually be some type of emerging structure frequency most of the time down this relatively extreme slope. So if you define, usually you will see that on the bar level, if you can define the slope, do enter early, deliberately, if you are willing to pursue such an opportunity based on momentum. The other general class of opportunities that this structure suggests is the reliability of the waterline. If these price levels, considered consensus for a while, have defined in this case a bottom or a waterline, then once the rejection happens, we can anticipate that as we return eventually to this waterline, it might act as resistance. And you can see here that as we move forward, once we arrive at the waterline, it tends to act as a door. In other words, prices are now considered expensive beyond this waterline here. And ultimately you see that so we stay at that door for a while, and ultimately we move away back in the other direction. Let's consider another example here from earlier in the week. This is a great example of an island. You can see that following the build-up in this base here, and namely here in the morning within this Wednesday session, we do get an explosion to the upside here, steep, relatively vertical price action, and we move well outside of the range established previously. In other words, price is breaking new ground here relative to recent price action as it's extending outside of the range. Then a consensus forms. In this case, my perception is that price was considered fair here within this horizontal or balanced structure for a while, and then on the right edge of the chart, of course, if the bullish sentiment will maintain, you will see some form of higher lows and higher highs. In this case, we break here the perceived waterline, and then start moving to the downside in a relatively steep fashion. You can see the microstructure building up in these just over $100 pullbacks or consolidations, and the opportunity here, if you're looking for the momentum opportunity, emerges as well, either within these clusters, if you can define them, or along some type of bearish frequency that you can hopefully define here. This is one good candidate. You can see that price roughly hugs this line on the way down. So the earlier you get positioned in a steep directional movement, the better both risk versus reward and the relative placement of the stop will be. Of course, inherently the trade-off with pursuing fast moving or steep moving price is the trade-off between confirmation, how much information you wait to see on the chart before you decide to jump on the premise, and absolute price that you manage to get into the opportunity. Further down this goes, the more likely is that the island formation is genuine, because you see sentiment on the right side of the balance structure that is similar to the one on the left, suggesting that indeed these prices here above, in this case 1791.92, are considered are being rejected after deliberation in the island, and therefore price is quickly rolling back to look for a solid base of support. Indeed, you can see that in this case the momentum opportunity would have taken you all the way back down to this base, and maybe even lower by the end of the session. Let's examine the reliability roughly here of the waterline. I'll put a horizontal line here, and as we follow price action later within the week, here we fell somewhat short of the waterline, but within the next session, we climb very close to this waterline, and it seems that price is getting rejected at these levels. You can see that we virtually brush here within $100 from this waterline, and then ultimately sentiment gets rejected from these levels. So a very good example of travel outside of the well-established range, a period of deliberation to build up a horizontal or balanced structure, and then a steep rejection which erodes price, in this case all the way back to the bottom of this range. A bearish island, you can see here within this session that starts right here. This is the 1st of July. Here within the better part of the European session, we build up a bit of a range. Price tries to extend higher, manages to deliberate here a little bit, and then promptly comes back around. Now, I guess you could also make a case that this is some form of an island, as we traveled into fresh prices, stayed balanced, and then got rejected relatively steeply. But it seems that here the island wasn't very far into the ocean, so to say, or it wasn't very far in thin air before the new consensus here got established. For me, the better example of an island is down here, where following this steep descent, we momentarily built here a waterline or a balanced structure below, and then ultimately we travel away from this level in a fashion very similar to the one that we arrived at, to the balance structure, which is vertical and steep. And again, the momentum opportunity here lies relatively early as we move back into the water or away from the island. You can see that the frequency that builds up here is actually fairly consistent, and the earlier you get positioned, the better. I would suggest that at the latest, somewhere at these price levels, you should be already positioned, even though you know, in anticipation of the situation developing as such, you might have jumped here even earlier in this vicinity if you observe that the waterline seems to be breaking with steep directional movement. Ultimately, if we follow this opportunity, we'll see that yes, if you get positioned relatively early or even a little bit later here, maybe within this cluster of price, you will take a little bit of heat, but ultimately price will keep moving in the direction until it reaches a significant base. In this case, over the course of the next session, you see that we do manage to not only get to this base but also break through this base as the bullish sentiment here seems to be developing on higher lows and higher highs. In this particular case, the island formation is still inside the session's range, but relative to this balance point, this is a vertical excursion into levels that have not been explored here for, it seems, more than 12 hours. So within this conditional context, the island formation could be considered. As is always the case, formations or structural observations do appear in some type of preceding context, and therefore not a single element on the chart will be decisive for you to take the opportunity. Always do consider your ongoing risk versus reward, and look for confluence or more than a singular logic, in other words, to define a certain opportunity. This tape reading concepts, and this is Islands.